It's my pleasure to introduce Sylvia Berryman from the University of British Columbia. Sylvia studied ancient Greek philosophy at the University of Texas before she joined the department at UBC in 2004. Before that, she worked as the editorial assistant on the Ancient Commentators on Aristotle's project at the University of London, a project which I was also fortunate enough to work on as well. Then she spent 5 years at Ohio State in the philosophy department with former colleague of ours, Bob Batterman. Her research focuses on ancient Greek natural philosophy and the impact that Greek science had on natural philosophy. And so she's written a nice long list of papers, including Horror Vacui in the 3rd century BC, when a theory is not a theory, Democritus and the explanatory power of the void, Rainbows, Mirrors, and Light, Can Aristotle's Theory of Vision Be Saved? And she has most recently published a book entitled The Mechanical Hypothesis in Ancient Greek Natural Science with Cambridge. She's currently working on a book on Aristotle's moral naturalism, and also does work in the field of applied ethics, and specifically in the challenges of extreme poverty. Part of which is a project, if I get this right, which you do in connection with a project that gives students a chance to study abroad in Guatemala. Is that right? So her talk today is How Many Philosophers Does It Take to Haul a Ship? Thoughts on the Philosophical Reception of Ancient Greek Mechanics. So if you join me in welcoming
Thanks. What I'd like to do today is go back to some of the material that I was trying to put together in the book project and try to think about what some of its implications are. So I'll do a bit of overview and try to tease out some of the bigger picture questions. So I hope you don't mind if I go back a little bit to really where I started from, which is an open question about the fact that ancient Greek mechanics had inspired the mechanical hypothesis, or the clockwork universe, in the early modern period. And as it's acknowledged by scholars, that one of the reasons for this had to do with the recovery of some of the ancient texts. And that raises a natural question. If the text inspired such an interesting approach to studying the natural world in the early modern period, why didn't the Greeks have a similar response? And there's what I guess I take to be a standard view that you find among histories of science, that really the reason for this was that the ancient Greek philosophers thought mechanics worked against nature, was an art and not a science, or engaged in deceptive trickery. And I'm just going to assert that that's false. I can come back to that if you want to know more about that. But so I began looking at the ancient Greek view of what mechanics was, with a commitment to take mechanics to mean what the ancient Greeks took it to mean, as well as I could. A couple of summaries of the field, and I just put up the one by Pappus of Alexandria. There were others, one in Proclus. These are really trade descriptions, the names of the people doing the work rather than the fields themselves. But one thing I want to draw attention to is the fact that the terms here used to name the different fields are very fluid. For instance, mechanopoio in this case is Pappus claims it's the people who are building instruments for raising water. But in other texts in Aristotle, those are the people who are building catapults. The terms are very much under construction, and they're not. You don't get a fixed technical vocabulary. But I also want you to notice that it's a very varied field. And I particularly chose this picture, which is in effect pneumatic technology, as illustrative of the idea of the mechanical hypothesis, simply to emphasize the idea that we shouldn't take one particular branch of mechanics as being definitive of mechanics as a whole. This is I could explain this to you if you like. It's a beautiful piece. Montaigne claims to have seen one of these working in the gardens of Tivoli on his tour of Italy. I love this piece. It's worked by water coming into an airtight box that has a self-starting siphon that starts an outflow when it gets to this point. So until this point, the pressure's building, and you start to get air coming out through the whistles. And in fact, the birds start to sing. When it gets to this point, you get a sudden outflow of water, which turns the crank, and the owl looks away. So the thought is that when the owl turns and glares at the birds, they stop singing. And then gradually, as the owl turns away, the pressure builds up and the birds start tweeting again. I think this would go on indefinitely. So some general characteristics of ancient Greek mechanics as a field. It's a messy field, loosely connected, and I've stared at the text for a long time trying to think about what unifying principle there is. I've come up with a technical term, devices that do things. I'm claiming that's about as good as you're going to get for an explanation of what's going on. And there are theories of these effects that follow the invention of devices and only imperfectly capture them into some kind of a unified framework. And some of the devices I'm claiming are probably extensions of the theory, but in principle, the inclusion in the field seems to be based on results, stuff you can actually build. I tried building one of these. I could get it more or less to work on a good day. It's a millet-powered robot. It's basically a siloed millet with a weight on top, and there's a trapdoor. So you're the magician, right? You're putting on a show. What you do is you pull out the trapdoor before your audience sees you, and then as the millet trickles down, the weight pulls the rope, and the device starts moving by itself. Hero claims that he can make it go in a 4 square. There's a second set of wheels that lower by a wooden screw that's operated by a second device that comes off the same initial starter mechanism, and it can go like this in the square. I think he's bluffing. I could have had a better hardware store than he did. I could barely make the initial thing work. I think that he's extending his theory based on parts that he can work individually. I'm not sure he necessarily built this particular extension, but in general, the devices in the, I think the principle for inclusion is that the devices can be made to work. Okay, so I'm claiming that mechanics as a field did originate some significant theories, particularly around the compositionality of motion. The idea of quantifying this notion of force. This is used very generally, very vaguely, but the notion is that there are some techniques for giving some kind of way of measuring this notion, or something like it. The elasticity of matter. That's an idea that I think first comes up in the mechanical devices. And the idea that you can have an indefinite sequence of, extended sequences of determinate effects from a single cause. That's sloppy, sorry. Okay. And that it's primarily experimental, that it's producing results. It's making water flow uphill or suspend in midair. It's throwing rocks further. It's building self-moving devices. And it has some rough and ready techniques for quantifying what we might call force or power, dunamis. The idea that what's really the limiting feature here is the amount of weight that a person can lift. That's understood to be limited. What the devices are primarily doing is trying to think about how to increase that by using devices. So the thought is that in the case of a balance, it's understood that if you have a smaller weight that's closer to the fulcrum, it will balance, and that these are mathematical proportionalities. When you apply this to the lever, the thought is you can think about the lever as, in effect, a balance. The amount of dunamis, power that would take to lift it, can be thought of in terms of something that's comparable to the weight with a little bit more added. So that's the notion that you can use weight to think about notions like force. So I'm going to talk about the philosophical reception and why people have typically thought there wasn't one in ancient Greece. And really, sorting out what's going on in the 4th century is pretty essential to this story. Because the first treatise that survives in the ancient Greek mechanical tradition comes under Aristotle's name, and yet Aristotle doesn't seem to make a lot of use of it. So if we think it is in fact by Aristotle, there's a pretty good reason to think that exactly the philosopher you think would be most interested in mechanics is somehow setting it aside or treating it as a very small part of his overall schema. So I'm interested in trying to sort out how we should read the history of the 4th century. Aristotle does mention mechanics as one of the 4 sciences that are intermediary between mathematics and natural philosophy, along with astronomy, optics, and harmonics, the so-called mathematica mixta or intermediate sciences. And the first surviving treatise is in his corpus. And there's also a story that Archytas, one of Plato's associates, founded mechanics. And that would fit in rather nicely with that. But then the puzzle that if Aristotle knew about this material, why does he make so little use of it? Edward Hussey did the best job of trying to argue that Aristotle is using mechanical theory in his physics. I'll show you why I think one of his central pieces of evidence doesn't really work. That works in the opposite direction, in order to really, in effect, undermine the standard view that there's a separation of art and nature going on. So here's my reading. That the references to Archytas founding mechanics are really about ballistics. This is one of the branches of mechanics, and it's one of the pretty important ones in the 3rd century, which is the 4th century, which is catapult building. So if you're a sort of cost-effective engineer, what you do is you start out with a small model. You find the dimensions that get an effective throwing device, and then you scale it up. You make it bigger using proportional ratios. And it's understood that I think the relationship is between the size of the borehole and the weight of the stone. Those need to be kept constant. In order to do this effectively, you have to solve cube roots. So there's some pretty tough mathematics involved, and I think that's really where Archytas comes in. He's one of the people who came up with a solution to the cube root. So to that sense, he's credited with systematizing ballistics. This gets Gloucester's having founded mechanics. It doesn't need to be something he actually applied to that particular problem himself. So I'm claiming that despite the references to a mathematical discipline in the posterior analytics, Aristotle really reflects very few of the ideas of the pseudo-Aristotelian Mechanica. Some people try to explain it by saying it's an early work. More people are inclined to say it's actually by a member of Aristotle's school a couple of generations later. And I'm inclined to that reading. So here's some of the key ideas in the Mechanica. The idea of unifying a number of different devices under a single explanatory framework. Something about circular motion. But it's using a very un-Aristotelian distinction between natural and unnatural motion. Again, you either have to say it's an early work and Aristotle changed his mind, or it's not Aristotle's. The use of weight in balance as a measure of force, and what, if you don't mind me calling, the vector addition of forces. But in Aristotle, there's little explicit connection. There's some connection between some devices, but there's a clearly different distinction between non-natural and natural motion. And circular motion is consistently considered simple and natural. I hate using claims quite as generality in case it's something I haven't thought of, but I'm going to say there's no use of weight to measure force. And when it comes to the vector addition, I'm claiming that the passage that Hussey points to about tacking up wind is actually arguing the opposite direction. So this is a passage in Aristotle's talking about what sailors do. They rely on the headwind that blows, they rely on the side wind that blows simultaneously to the headwind. And it's a question about how you can tack up wind. You'd require a tailwind that's directly opposed to the headwind, but any such wind would be completely cancelled by the stronger opposing wind. So instead of seeing the two winds as somehow being added together, he sees the weaker one as being cancelled by the stronger one. So I'm saying he's not thinking about the powers of components in a compound being treated quantificationally, that he does have this idea of threshold minima. So if you accept this suggestion that perhaps the Mechanica isn't a work of Aristotle's, and we shouldn't actually be assessing the reception of ancient Greek mechanics by looking at Aristotle, you get the following picture. The theories of the Mechanica weren't fully articulated. Archytas might be credited only with the mathematics that are crucial for ballistics, and the Mechanica plausibly dates from the early 3rd century. There's some textual suggestions that back that up. And we should really be looking at the philosophical reception of mechanics after Aristotle. So, Hellenistic mechanics. Just a few hits of some of the sorts of things that are going on. In early 3rd century Alexandria, there's an engineer, Ctesibius, who's clearly doing a lot of very interesting work, including discovering what I think called compression effects. He seems to be building moving automata that are using more processions. There's some stories. You have to be a little bit careful with the literary stories. I think in some cases they're not trustworthy, but I think these may be. There's some pretty good evidence that ballistic theory is formalizing the ratios for scaling up catapult prototypes. Philo of Byzantium reports some of these, and he's also credited with some really fancy theatrical displays. He wrote a collection on mechanics, which includes, some books have been lost, some have survived. You get much more sophisticated work in Hero of Alexandria. Right, so the philosophical reception. So we do see philosophers using ideas from the Mechanica tradition to study circular motion, to think about equilibrium and addition of forces. These are occasional references here and there, but I think they do show that the philosophers are not regarding the work of mechanics as being separate from natural philosophy, even if they're not necessarily applying it terribly systematically. And I do think that this theory of elasticity of matter is, in Stoic theory, is actually based on Ctesibius' devices. So he, in effect, discovered the spring of the air. He uses it in catapults, as described by Philo of Byzantium, but he was also using some kind of piston devices. So I think he's, if you look at the Stoic texts on eutonia and the way that they're using this idea that matter has this elasticity, I think that's not, you can't find that really before the 3rd century. I looked at some of the references in earlier philosophical texts, and they don't show the same property of elasticity. The term actually meant something different. So I think Stoics are drawing from matter theory. You also see cases of the doctors looking at pneumatic technology to understand the fluid distribution in the body. The best text of this is Galen, who's railing against it. We don't have very much of the originals. We mostly get the people rejecting this approach. So it's a reconstruction, but I think you can see it. And also think you can see Philoponus, this is quite a lot later in late antiquity, developing a new theory of the power of the void, and I think also that's a response to the work of in pneumatics. So other evidence, the use of automata as a heuristic to demonstrate that a determinate sequence of motions can be produced by material causes. The mechanical model for the coordination of motions of distinct heavenly bodies, and that it also was taken to undermine the need for explanatorily reducible powers to explain the goal-directed sequences in organisms. Again, you see this evidence mostly in people like Galen resisting, claiming that we do in fact need irreducible powers to explain the specificity of the different organs of the body. You couldn't explain it as just like a device. And yeah, I think the reception of mechanics in antiquity was undeniably piecemeal. We just have a few really vestigial reports, generally people rejecting this approach. I think that teleological thinking prevailed in all of the major schools. The Aristotelian system triumphed in Neoplatonism, and not because they systematically excluded mechanics.
I think that's very clear in somebody like Proclus, who's totally on board with the Aristotelian notion of taking mechanics as one of the mathematica mixta, and yet doesn't believe it's an adequate approach to natural philosophy. I think you can see some texts that show vestigial awareness of this mechanical hypothesis. This is from Plotinus, of all people. But we must exclude levering from the operations of nature. For what kind of thrusting or levering can produce this rich variety of colours and shapes of every kind? For the model makers, people have actually looked to them and thought nature's workmanship was like theirs. Or Gregory of Nyssa, he's actually talking about the idea that we, human beings, could be just like these devices. We see many such things contrived by the makers of machines, in which they arrange matter skillfully to imitate nature, sometimes in motion and in representation of a kind of voice. In such cases, indeed, the phenomenon does not lead us to suppose that an intelligent power brings about in each machine the appearance, form, sound, or motion. If we should say that the same also happens in the case of this mechanical instrument of our nature, we might say that no intelligent essence is infused in us according to the peculiarity of nature, but some kinetic power resides in the nature of the elements in us. So you do see references like this to the hypothesis that nature could work like a machine. And yet I think there's some good reasons for rejecting it as a general hypothesis. You see that in Galen, that the mechanics techniques are really inadequate to account for the selectivity of organs for appropriate fluids. He thinks that each organ has its own special powers for attracting the juices or repelling the ones that it doesn't need, and that you couldn't produce these simply by bottom-up structural arrangements the way that pneumatic devices are able to channel fluids. He explicitly considers that hypothesis and says that we need qualitative change, not just structural rearrangement. And Plotinus, the mechanical picture of cosmology can't account for qualitative change, the colours and the shapes. And Proclus and Gregory both explicitly think about the idea that human beings, as part of nature, must have immaterial minds to account for our ability to construct automata. So we can't be machines. So the idea that we are the builder of the machines is evidence that we're not part of the machine. The implications of the mechanical hypothesis. This is one, I think, very interesting ones, and resonates with some of the texts that Devon's worked on, that determinate causal sequences follow without ongoing intelligent intervention. The idea that you could build a device that, quote, works by itself, it needs both to be constructed and to have an instigating cause. But it's the internal construction of the device that governs the extent, the kind, and the direction of the changes that follow. That nature works by structural rearrangements without genuine qualitative change, perhaps. And that it assumes a linear relationship between the properties of the parts and properties of the whole. Mahoney talks about mechanics or machines as being quintessentially analytic. That gets at that idea. And possibly there's no room for material minds. Okay, so the ship-hauler problem. This is an attempt to reconstruct why I think that the philosophers of the Neoplatonist schools in particular rejected the mechanical hypothesis and what its claims really were taken to be. And I'm reconstructing this from one passage in Simplicius, so it's somewhat speculative. It's a difficult passage, but I think this is at least a suggestion about what's really going on, what the big picture story is here. So it goes back to Archimedes. He's working in the 3rd century, and I think in the ancient tradition there isn't this separation between the messy practical and the clean mathematical stuff that's associated with Archimedes. I think he's in effect trying to account for Ctesibius devices based on the displacement of fluids, and there's some suggestion that he's even trying to come up with a unified account of equilibrium to unite the theory of the balance and hydrostatics. Right, so I think that saying about moving the earth is in effect a challenge to the philosophers, claiming the generality of mechanics. So they're conflicting accounts of the ship Hall of Feet. But I think he's asserting the indefinite extendability of the mathematical relationships that hold between certain parameters. He's ignoring practical straits and idealizing, but he's taken to be thumbing his nose at Aristotle. So Aristotle had said that if it takes 100 men to haul a ship a given distance in a given time, this doesn't mean that one man can haul the ship 100th of the distance or in 100 times the time. So Aristotle's claiming that there are threshold minima in effect. What Archimedes did was show that one man can haul a ship. The different accounts of the move the earth story, I think, are asserting rhetorically that with his lever or pulley or windlass, the accounts differ on which device he's using, you can extend indefinitely to move any given quantity. And it's possible for any given power to move any given weight with the right devices. And this, in effect, became one of the three classic problems of mechanics, to raise a given weight with a given power. Mathematics has three problems, so mechanics has three too. And the weightlifter or the barokos was used to, in effect, solve this. Some people think it's really just a kind of a thought device. Try to think about how many intervening cogs you need in order to raise a given weight with a given power. But not all the mechanics are convinced that you can extend these relationships indefinitely. So we have two accounts, at least, that I found of practicing mechanics who are raising doubts about the idea that you can add forces together. Philo Byzantium claims in a couple of places that two halves of a catapult spring don't work in unison. They actually conflict with one another. Or two tugs don't tow a ship twice as fast. Vitruvius is really suspicious of the idea that you could scale up indefinitely with catapults. He has this lovely story about somebody trying to do this and ends up with this huge monstrosity getting bogged down in the mud. So I think the generality claim has its critics even among the mechanics, and I think the philosophers do take it on, at least as evidence of Simplicius directly addressing it. He takes Archimedes to be assuming that the sum of the whole are the sum of the powers of the parts. Sorry, the powers of the whole are the sum of the powers of the parts. But in his metaphysics, at least given Aristotle's theory of mixture, the parts only exist within the whole in potential. So he's asserting that the kind of general linear relationships that Archimedes is discussing only exist in limited contexts, and that there are threshold minima. This became a very important doctrine for the Neoplatonists, apparently. The second... change the order, I shouldn't have done that. The minima naturalia doctrine takes up from a passage in Aristotle that's not particularly significant, but makes apparently more of this, the idea that material conditions aren't sufficient to account for the supervenience of properties of mixture. They're merely necessary. Supervenience here is an old term that's long time been used to translate the Greek term epigignomon. The idea is that in Neoplatonist schema, the material base is merely the conditions for the form that comes in from outside, as it were. But you also see, without that particular kind of metaphysics, a much simpler objection in Galen. Copenhagen did the work on this. Really, that the distinction can be made between the properties that can be accounted for by material composition and occult ones that can't. So think about magnetism. If you took apart a magnetic rock versus a non-magnetic one, the material composition would be virtually identical, yet they have a property as a whole that's pretty different. So the thought is that you can see how, in some cases, certain properties seem to be products of the material components, whereas others seem to be unexplainable. I think that's Copenhagen traces the term occult to a Greek term. It really just means it can't be said in terms of the properties of the parts. And I think that is part of the thought here, the governing idea. And also seen some interesting texts in John Philoponus, again from the Neoplatonist period, looking at the way that nonlinear nature changes in chemical properties follow changes in the matter. We're just going to run through this example very, very quickly, because I think it is a really interesting case of somebody pointing to some of the objections to the generality of a mechanical picture, though he doesn't use the term in this context. He's looking at the idea of heating honey. You've got something that's white and solid, and you're changing the material property, in this case the heat, which is considered to be a lower level property, on a continuum. You're heating it gradually, and yet when it reaches a certain point, you get a complete change in the supervening properties, the color and the liquidity. The honey changes at one point very drastically in the properties that supervene. And it demonstrates, he thinks, the existence of minima for the supervenience of properties. So chemical change, this isn't the term used again, but it can't be subsumed by the linear mathematical relationships that are used in mechanics. So here's my version of what I think the Neoplatonist response to mechanics is. This is summarizing from hints that are very scattered and trying to pull together what might be a general thesis about their resistance to mechanics as a hypothesis. But I think they claim it's not general enough as a theory of everything. That chemical change shows the existence of minima for the supervenience of these forms. And the linear relationships can't be extended indefinitely. That mechanics is in effect only valid in a limited domain, and Aristotelian physics is more comprehensive. Okay, so I think it's worth saying something about what this has to do with atomism, particularly if you're looking at the mechanical hypothesis from the point of view of the 17th century. Because if you think that this is true, that there are in fact two different time periods when you have this mechanical hypothesis being considered, I think it's important to look at some of the differences in the way they played out as well as the similarities. I think we tend to look at ancient atomism in retrospect using some 17th century terminology. It's often called mechanistic by modern commentators. When I started becoming self-conscious of this, I started looking around in the literature and made a list of people who were calling ancient atomists mechanistic, and I was actually one of them myself. So the idea is that the new science is rejecting Aristotelian forms in favor of mechanistic and corpuscular theories at the same time. But if the mechanical hypothesis had only been considered in the 17th century, we might think it really had this close connection with a given matter theory. But in antiquity, I think there's really no evidence of a link between atomism and mechanical conceptions. But nonetheless, this might seem right. If you consider the fact that mechanical philosophers like Gassendi and Charlton drew on ancient atomism, or that other 17th century sources describe ancient atomists as mechanical. And there are, in fact, some real similarities between the ancient and modern matter theories, only ascribing certain properties to body or rejection of secondary qualities. But I think these are illusory, or perhaps stronger than they appear. Boyle really rejected atomism. He didn't think that void was necessary, the corpuscles were divisible, and he has a teleological account of the origins. Gassendi, who really preferred Epicurus to the more mechanistic, if you like, Democritus, really accepts some principles that are completely incompatible with ancient atomism, in fact, with their guiding metaphysical assumptions, because he accepts creation ex nihilo and thinks that divine providence supplies the order. But it's really Henry Moore and Ralph Cudworth who are the best evidence for thinking that we should call the ancient atomists mechanical, because they did in fact compare it to Cartesian mechanical philosophy. So I spent some really fun time reading Cudworth and Moore. They're great, highly recommended. Particularly Cudworth's True Intellectual System of the Universe. It's a fabulous work. I think it's one of the most thoroughly scholarly treatments of early Greek philosophy that's available at the time. Monty Johnson has done some work on this and really helped me with this. If you look at the competitors, Thomas Stanley, he's really just repeating Diogenes Laertius. It has very few sources compared to Cudworth. I just tracing some terminology that enters philosophical lexicon that really just traces back to Cudworth and becomes accepted even in 20th century philosophy as appropriate terms for describing the ancients, like hylozoism. I think Cudworth is pretty influential in the reception of ancient philosophy. He goes around describing pretty much everybody, every pre-Socratic, as mechanical, including people like Protagoras. He's really interested in challenging the pernicious atheism of ancient materialism. And I think Moore actually shows some of the concerns with the scholarliness of this reading a bit more acutely. I love this. The Cartesian philosophy being in a manner the same with that of Democritus, and that of Democritus the same with the physiological part of Pythagoras' philosophy. And Pythagoras the same with the Sidonian. This is Moccus of Sidon, and also the Sidonian with the Mosaical. This is Moses. It would be necessary to follow that the Mosaical philosophy in the physiological part thereof is the same with the Cartesian. Yeah. Yes. So I'm suggesting that might not be our best authority. Robert Pasnow's done some good work also on whether or not this primary-secondary quality distinction that we see in early modern philosophers like Locke is really effectively comparable with Democritus. I think has shown effectively that he really isn't. They're just different theories. And there's some systematic differences between ancient atomism and ancient mechanics that really shouldn't lead us to treat them as parallel. So some lessons learned, I think, hope, that we can evaluate the similarities between the ancient Greek atomism and early modern corpuscularianism without deferring to 17th century usage. Gabby's done some interesting work on how taxonomies can mask the historical formation and justification of categories. I'm claiming that mechanical explanation should not be treated as a natural kind or as something that's commonsensical. It's a historically evolving idea. And it's not per se linked to any matter theory. So what might be mechanical in ancient Greek natural philosophy? Well, the use of theories and techniques from mechanics in natural philosophy, clearly. The use of comparisons to devices from mechanics to understand natural processes. The appeal to the mechanical construction to understand the relationship of design to determinate causal sequencing. You get the same idea that you see in some 17th century sources, the idea that, yeah, there may have been a designer, but that's not part of the ongoing operation of the devices. God may come in and wind up things every once in a while. But in effect, they run by themselves. We should treat them as running by themselves. So we think of the operation as being mechanical, even if the construction still requires teleology. And really, I think the fundamental idea that we get associated with the idea of the mechanical, it's a deictic. It works like that. It's a point of comparison. So I'm saying that the reception of mechanics in antiquity is arguably comparable to the early modern period on a much more limited scale. There are some people who refer to, we don't even know their names. Galen's famous for being rude about people he's referring to. But other people, we just don't know anything about them, other than the evidence of their detractors. The mechanical hypothesis seems to have been forgotten and rediscovered, perhaps, with the reintroduction of ancient texts. I'm not sure about the forgotten, because I don't know enough about the transmission there, but it's not prima facie perceived as un-Aristotelian, and it's not associated with atomism or any particular matter theory. So it's results-driven, I think, bottom-up or experimental. Some kind of rough-and-ready techniques for quantifying. It uses automation as a model for determinate causal sequences. And that comes out very specifically in some philosophical texts where people are looking to devices to get the idea that causal sequences could result in a determinate result. I didn't bring the text with me on that, but there are some. And it's not integrated into natural philosophy because of doubts about its generality. But here's something I'm interested in. George Ray really forced me to see this. There's one of the things that people are doing when they're pointing to mechanics as a model is there's a psychologically convincing point of appeal. We think we understand the causal processes in these constructed devices. I'm kind of interested in why. So this is where I'm going beyond the historical scholarship and trying to suggest where I think some of the implications for this might be. I'm a bit out of them here, but that's... Okay, so I think that claim that the philosophical role of the appeal to mechanics is independent of the matter theory that's being employed, and that a disparate, experientially driven field of mechanics played a historical role in establishing a reference point for the properties that could be ascribed to matter. So if you look at the discussions about matter in the 17th century compared to the comparable discussions in antiquity, for instance, of the Stoics, you don't have this idea that you can look to what the mechanics are taking to be their properties, to decide what properties you ought to be able to include, and help to create a consensus about the common sense properties of matter and about what properties could be ascribed. For instance, there's a debate between Moore and Boyle about whether gravity or weight is mechanical. And Boyle responds that if it's something that the mechanics are using in their equations, then that's good enough, whereas Moore wants to refer to an analytic notion of mechanical to try and rule it out. Boyle's insisting on the deictic notion. It's what the mechanics do. So I suggest that if historically mechanical means drawing on the discipline of mechanics to understand the working of nature, something that works like that, and this is Boyle again, mechanical explications of natural phenomena do give so much more satisfaction to ingenious minds than those that must employ substantial forms, sympathy, antipathy, etc., that the more judicious of the vulgar philosophers themselves prefer them before all others when they can be had. It's that term, satisfaction to ingenious minds, that I want to think about for a moment. I think he's insisting on the idea that the mechanical device is a paradigm of intelligibility. We understand its workings, or I think we understand its workings, because we know how it's composed, so the bottom-up assembly. I think even more than this, that there's satisfaction that there's no mysterious supervening form or occult quality creeping in somehow. Well, why? We have this confidence that we identified all the causal factors because we can manipulate all of the parameters. And I think we can even go to Philosophers for some thoughts on what that's all about. Ask a Neoplatonist question: why not suppose that there are supervening forms that enter and complicate the bottom-up explanation? Philosophers sees the discontinuities in proportional covariations, the limits, the point-like change, the chemical change, suggests that there are supervening forms. And perhaps the interesting psychological satisfaction that comes from mechanical devices is that they exhibit these continuous proportional covariations. There's no thresholds. And convinces us that we've correctly identified the causal factors. So I'm wondering whether the appeal to mechanical here, in an extended sense, is really honorific. That we're appealing to a field of work where we have this satisfaction. So by 1670, and again this is work that early modern scholars have done, mechanics came to be used as a theory of motion that was susceptible to mathematical treatment, and in effect left its moorings in mechanics behind. It became used as a general term for a mathematical treatment of motion. And these two notions diverged, and they really caused some controversy. For instance, whether Newton's theory of gravitation should be considered mechanical because it satisfied one criteria, not the other. So my question is whether this new use illicitly imports supposed intelligibility of constructed device onto phenomena that are being described mathematically, or whether these extended uses of the mechanical should better be disambiguated or even discarded for more precise language. These are questions I don't have answers to, but I think I should at least try to answer my original question. So from the point of view of ancient Greek philosophers, how many philosophers does it take to haul a ship? Well, we've got some resources for that answer. So I think the response that you get from the Neoplatonist philosopher to Archimedes is really in effect to up the ante. Sure, you can haul a ship, but can you turn straw into gold? Thanks.
Do you have a question? I don't think we need the mic for that. So, questions? Chris?
So, I know almost nothing about ancient Greek mechanics, so this is a very left field question. But there's one thing that I was curious about regarding the generality problem, which is that you're focusing on the case where you have an extended sequence with effects that you can see is generated from a single cause. And that's sort of very concrete in thinking about how these machines have sort of an origin and evolution. Whereas in the 17th century, there seems to be a way of thinking that you start to think about the laws governing the process, and that's already a more general way of accounting for why there'd be an orderly sequence of events when you see a particular machine doing its thing. So I'm wondering if part of the reason why the generality problem is so pressing is because the Greeks are thinking about it in terms of concrete instances of sequences and effects as opposed to a notion of law kind of governing that sequence. So that seems to be quite a different thing that arises in the 17th century.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think some of the, I think there's a continuity there, that some of the techniques that result in these ideal mathematical laws are really coming from mechanics. I mean, you see people, I'm certainly not a 17th century scholar, but you see people like Galileo and Stefan using this kind of idea that you think about something rolling down a slope is equivalent to something balancing at a certain point, and then think about how much, imagine a pulley holding, a weight holding this in balance, to try to think about how to quantify the things that we're talking about here. Galileo talks about approximating the power of the void that's holding together two marble slabs by thinking about what kind of weight would it take to pull them apart. So I do think, you get that notion of that you can quantify coming out of the appeal to mechanics. So the theoretical baggage that goes along with this in antiquity is much at an earlier stage. I think that's right. I don't think it's, with the notion of the causal sequences, I don't think the thought is that there's one cause producing a sequence by itself. It's that the device is constructed in such a way that you can, from one occasion, the process will start by itself, but it's a construction of the device that's governing what happens.
But they don't say things like, here's a law governing how gears work, such that you could understand from the set of laws governing the components of the machine how the...
Yes.
Do they do that?
No.
No, okay. No. Yeah, that's what I was intending as a concept.
not aware of anything quite that complicated.
Right. I had another question, just a question of clarification about the notion of threshold that gets introduced. So I wasn't clear what kinds of explanations. So you sort of referred to chemical changes. And if you could just give me an example of a case where the Neoplatonists would say there's this sort of threshold rather than continuous covariation. And you mentioned one in your talk, but maybe just expand on that.
Yes, good. So the sweetness punny is one. The other classic one is the ship roller. So apparently there's a threshold before the ship will actually move. It's not that that's how it's understood. And I gather that in medieval philosophy becomes a much more technical term. I don't know many examples of that kind of discussion. I'd like to have more, but that's the thought that's going on. The other one that Simplicius cites is much more complicated. It's a sound of millet falling. That if you unload a bushel of millet, you get a sound. If you drop one millet grain, you won't. So it's a Sorites case. I had trouble with that passage in Simplicius because it seems to be wandering all over the place, and I couldn't figure out what exactly he's saying, how it applies to Archimedes, until I got this idea that he's talking about limits. So I was looking for other cases, and Philosophers is the best one I know. I wish I had more evidence of that, but this is a really speculative reconstruction with not a lot to go on. Then again, there's a lot of Neoplatonism and Neoplatonist discussions of powers that I really don't know, so it could be that there's more evidence I just don't know about it.
Wait.
You said something early on in the talk that piqued my curiosity and I'd like to hear more about it. On one of your early slides, there was a sort of passing mention of ancients giving mechanical explanations for the coordinated motion of heavenly bodies. Can you say something more about that?
Yeah.
What sort of explanations were they giving?
Right. I found a few. I haven't looked at them for a couple of years. Right. So there's some reference to ancient devices. I'd have to go look. Can I send you the footnotes?
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry, I didn't brief myself on that.
Please do. Because in particular, I'd be interested if anyone actually imagined some kind of mechanical connection between the motion of the sun and the motion of each planet on it. That doesn't happen. They were thought of as coordinated in the end.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, right. So there is some stuff like that in Theon of Smyrna. And there's a Latin author who rejects that approach on Manilius, I think, on the grounds that you don't have any connecting devices. So yeah, there is some evidence that people are thinking in those terms, but I can't cite the passages from memory. Please.
So, Democritus aside and the other atomists, I was wondering, I couldn't help but think of the other pre-Socratic philosophers as mechanists, especially the monists, the material monists.
Yes.
I couldn't tell, based on your talk, whether I should reject that or not.
I'm going to say you should reject that,
Yeah,
just because
you
there's
say
no
more.
evidence. I mean, the only thing that really has any plausible consideration is a reconstruction that somebody did of Anaximander theory of the stars, suggesting that it might be a mechanical device, and I think it just doesn't work. I don't see any evidence for it. Is materialism perhaps of a sort? But there's no evidence that there's any appeal to mechanics or anything we could usefully describe as mechanical. I mean, there are people who said that Homer has a mechanical conception because he talks about Hephaestus making golden handmaidens, robots. He's a god. Yeah. I think we need some actual mechanic. I think you can't have a mechanical conception unless you're referring to mechanics.
Yeah.
That's
Just
what I'm actually
story
saying.
of Davies damming or diking the river.
Yeah, I mean, I think he might have done some engineering. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know if you had
Yeah, I don't think there's much that we might... It's very hard to know what counts as a machine. Mechane can mean anything, as can machine in English, right? It's only recently that it came to mean something with working parts. I mean, devices that do things is a sort of technical term, if you like.
So maybe I'll... Oh, go ahead.
Chris's question about the laws, sort of. I'm thinking about, and especially seeing Galileo there. I mean, there certainly were equilibrium arguments that would be something like what we would think of as a law today. Just like think of the lever. What is the ratio of the weight you have to put at this distance in order to exactly balance?
Yes.
This, and there certainly was. What was the status that they thought? I mean, it's part of your thing about seeing how it works, but seeing how it works is seeing these connections.
Yes.
And these principles seem to me to have a wider thing than just this or that particular machine.
Yes.
And certainly I think for Archimedes, but I haven't read him enough to be sure of that. But to be sure I'm not reading back into him the way that we would think today. But that stuff does seem to have a kind of intelligibility that goes beyond merely seeing how the pieces fit. And that comes closer to what Chris was saying about wanting something like laws.
Right. So I'm resisting the term laws because of the implications of something imposed, right? So yes, you get these mathematical proportionalities, generally expressed in terms of ratio, proportions, and you see those, you see them in Plato, right? He's talking in Protagoras. He talks about the relative distance of a weight on a balance and the effect of that, and also in optics, right? Yes, there are proportional generalizations. There's an attempt to theorize and think about the mathematics. In the Pseudo-Aristotelian Mechanica, it's expressed in terms of the geometry of the circle. There's an attempt to work out why these sorts of relationships hold in terms of something you could compare to a law. I'm resisting that term because it comes with implications we don't want to do.
But in principle, having a deeper level than just this or that.
Absolutely, And Hussey tried to work out, make the best case for seeing Aristotle as recognizing those systematic proportional relationships as general throughout natural philosophy. I think it ultimately fails because fails to show that he's aware of all the stuff that's going on in the Pseudo-Aristotelian Mechanica because of this idea about the vector addition. He doesn't think of these causes as being additive.
Wait, you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I guess I would put that. Because it really struck me as you were saying, Bill, the examples, in particular in Archimedes, you were talking about belonging to the field of statics. And and there's certainly very general principles of statics, and they were driving there. But I took Chris to be asking about, did they have this idea of a dynamical law?
No, that's exactly right.
Kendall.
Thanks for your talk. That was stimulating. I wonder, you said that like 4th century philosophy is not very mechanical. Was it? And pre-Socratics. Is it not mechanical of them because they didn't make explicit reference to what mechanical people were doing? Or, and this is a set of the question, why is it not mechanical or mechanics in the Timaeus when Timaeus boils everything down to the tiny geometrical solids and explains burning is because fire is when the matter is shaped like these tetrahedra with these super tiny points, and burning is when these super tiny points cut into. Basically, burning is a form of cutting, I guess. Does that count as mechanical, just like not mechanics that affected the way we did mechanics 100 years after that?
I I'm suggesting that it's actually more useful to distinguish material efficient causality from the specific use of the reference to mechanics, because we miss the role of mechanics in fixing a certain kind of view of matter and what it can do and how it works, if we start out by conflating those. Because if we start out by calling any material causal efficient theory mechanical, we'd basically be missing what mechanics actually does, because we think that this is data house mechanization of the world picture. Right? Here's a account of antiquity. It's all about atomism. He doesn't care about mechanics because it's not compatible with atomism. He's interested in matter theory. And I'm saying that that's not the right way to read the prehistory of the reception of mechanical philosophy. If you separate these two things, you get a much clearer picture. So treat mechanical literally as the reference to mechanics. The way when we say you have a psychologistic theory of something, you're referring to your own view of psychology, or you have a legalistic conception of ethics, you're referring to your own conception of law. A mechanistic theory, mechanical theory, is one that draws on your understanding of mechanics. Something that works like that, and gets some mileage out of that from the reference.
Oh, I see. So mechanics, as it were, with a capital M, not the common noun mechanic, which just explains like the means to the end.
Yeah, mechanic can be anything.
Okay.
As could machine, as
Eric.
Thanks for this. I'm curious about the development of ideas in mechanics and in geology, for example. You mentioned earlier that Galen rejected the hypothesis, but to what extent do you think that there might be a mutual development in mechanics, so being informed by observing biology, or the other way around, informing theory in biology, looking at mechanics?
Yeah, I think Rotman wrote a piece on, I think, 3rd century medicine and the relationships between the mechanics, the people doing mechanics, and the doctors. I don't know very much about that period other than Aristotle. I think that's possibly true, but I don't have detailed knowledge of what's going on. Mostly what Galen's looking at is people who are trying to understand fluid dynamics in the body, right, which is one of the key problems, and they're doing it by reference to filters and what have you, and rather than thinking of each organ as having its own unique, attractive and repulsive powers. But I don't know really any more than that.
Henrik. And then Eric. So Henrik.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. I enjoyed that a lot. I want to ask you about, in your story, sort of about ancient mechanics, the fact that Mechanica is not by Aristotle plays a big role. But certainly later on, everybody thought that it was by Aristotle. I was wondering, from what I understand, when it became sort of circulated, it wasn't really that influential. Is that right? And if that's the case, why not? If they thought it was by Aristotle?
I don't know that it wasn't that influential. Again, it's a while since I've been reading. I've only looked at second-hand work on 16th century Italian mechanics. So certainly people are starting with texts like the Aristotelian Mechanica with Hero. And Hero's devices are still in circulation. Solomon Cos has a book of devices. It's got Hero and I think Archimedes uses Heroes on the frontispiece. And it's certainly claimed by scholars that these are certainly influential in the way people are approaching problems. Yes, of course, they develop new theories that go beyond them, but I think some of the techniques are going back to ancient ones. I think Rose and Brake say that it's really no accident that the recirculation of pseudo-Aristotelian Mechanica is a formative period for the new science.
I guess that raises an issue about how, I mean, if it's sort of used in that sense, but it strikes me as not very influential, for example, on the mechanical philosophers. You never find references to Aristotle. And the mechanics there.
Who we talk, to Aristotle, no. No, people are doing different things in the mechanical philosophy. I think Boyle is reading Greek sources. I think he's reading Galen, he's using Greek categories like central barricade. You would not think that was an English word, right? That's reference to ancient Greek mechanical tax. And I can't say very much more definitely than that.
I guess I just wonder, because there's when I'm thinking of mechanical philosophers, you mean the Cartesians,
yes,
and certainly the mechanical plays no role there.
I think, if I'm remembering rightly, and again, this is so not my field, but people like Mersenne were using an Aristotelian framework, and then that in effect gets taken up and changed. But I think the formative period for the mechanical philosophy did make reference to the Greek devices and theories.
Yeah. This is a follow-up to the other Eric's question. I'm curious how you would, in your general description of what you mean by mechanical in the ancient world, how you would characterize Sextus in the empirical school. Because it actually seems to share a lot of the features that you use to characterize what you mean by mechanistic. It's experience driven. It's based on instances. It talks about the indeterminate sequences of causes.
Well, I take Sextus to be committed to not having any views about what the world's like,
sure.
Just how it appears to me, right? He's not doing natural philosophy. I think his commitment to not theorizing is going to make a real difference there.
Really? Because I thought part of your whole point was that the ancient mechanists were not theory driven. We're not committed to theory construction. And in fact, by and large, did not construct theories.
Yeah, I mean, there are theories in the corpus, but I think they come afterwards, that the devices are there first. Well, Sextus isn't trying to make things work, but he's trying to...
Well, he's trying to keep the body work.
Yes. He's not fiddling around with devices. He's not building physical things, and I guess that's...
But as you're saying, mechanic can mean almost anything.
Mechanic can mean almost anything. Mechanicke comes to refer to a body of work with these widgets in it.
I misspoke, you're correct.
Yeah. I mean, Aristotle talks about Anaxagoras using mind as a mechanism. It's a very general term, but I think with the there's one exception that I found where there's a story in Aesop that I believe uses mechanikos in a non-technical context. But other than that, for anything any uses that are more general, I think mechanike and mechanema are much more specific to devices. Something you can actually build, at least in principle.
So I have a question, or maybe just something to elaborate on, related to what Kendall and what Wayne said. So you talk a lot about the mechanical worldview. Could you say a little bit more about the role of the view of the universe as an organism, the sort of organismic picture, and what role that might have played in resistance to thinking of nature as being studied mechanically? Specifically, Plato wouldn't see the universe as having gears, but rather he would have organs and parts. And so does that play... So if it's more like an organism, then it might that sort of broader philosophical view might block you from thinking that you can apply the techniques of the mechanics to the world as a whole.
I guess I take the dynamic of the debate between Galen and the other doctors, the Aristotelians and the Asclepiadians, to be something like, you can't argue, or if you don't need special powers, then you shouldn't be using them. Or at least the assumption seems to be that if you could do everything simply by these devices, that we don't have an argument for special powers. And when we've got special powers, then we've got a very different world picture, where we can bring in other sorts of explanatory devices. And I don't have any particularly good evidence that that's always the way it was. There may be people who have a commitment to an organic view for other reasons. But I think that's at least where Galen sees himself arguing defensively, that it's because the other picture is inadequate that his works.
So there's kind of two opposing views of the world, or the thinking of the cosmos as an organism and thinking of it as a machine.
Well, I think there may be others. I'm not sure. I don't really know Neoplatonist cosmologies well enough to know whether the organism view comes up very often, or whether they would simply describe it as a third alternative.
I mean, I'm thinking more of Plato, but also the Stoics.
Yeah. I don't really have... I mean, Plato's sort of really before this discussion comes on the stage. The Stoics are a bit harder. I think at least Marcus Aurelius does seem to be aware of this discussion. So it's harder to know where they would stand argumentatively. So I don't know whether they would take themselves to be committed to dropping that if it could be shown that you could do enough with it. But it's pretty hard to show that you could do enough with saying, well, an organism works like this, right? The sort of thing that the mechanical hypothesis is doing is, I think, incredibly ambitious. It's saying that because you can build a device that moves 2 feet without being touched, or you can build a theatre with a lightning bolt that drops out of the sky, that's evidence that we can explain embryonic development without special powers. That's a stretch. So, I think they are out on a limb, and that the balance of argument seems to be against them.
Thanks. Go ahead.
Shakespeare has these characters in Midsummer Night's Dream called the rude mechanicals. And, I guess they're devices that do things. They're one of those bellowsmen that are joiner and so on. But I wanted to ask you about. I guess I'm not sure I completely follow what you were saying about material and efficient causation in relationship to what you consider a mechanism. I was wondering how influential you think Plato's Phaedo was in any of the later discussions, where he seems to be the first one to really distinguish material and efficient causes and dismisses them pretty decisively in favor of formal final causes. Do later philosophers quote what he says about bones and sinews and use it to use that discussion to infer that mechanical causes are perhaps of much less significance in explaining things like bodily motions?
Well, the second part first. I think we're generally working in an Aristotelian framework for explanation, that the Neoplatonists add more causes on naturally. So the question about teleology is there. And it goes something like this. Do we need to think that we can use that we need teleological accounts of the powers of a particular organ, for instance, the heart attract its own juices, or could we explain these by structural arrangements of the parts, by material efficient causes? And the argument seems to be that if we are allowed to draw this analogy to the way devices work, we could see how the workings, how one cause leads to another, could be carried out by structural arrangements, by material efficient causes, even though the structure as a whole seems to be constructed. So you do get this argument that pushes back the teleology to God. There's a passage in Cicero where he's looking at the device, the cosmic device that Archimedes constructed, and say, well, if the heavens did work like this would just show more clearly the intelligence of the designer. So there's a notion that even if you've got material efficient causation and workings, there's still room for teleology, as there is in some 17th century philosophers, in constructing the whole to run by itself. That's a much more intelligent construction. To the business about Shakespeare, I think that's actually separate tradition. That there's a medieval use of the mechanical arts that's much broader, and that has nothing to do with the way it's the tradition that comes out of the Greek devices. And it's actually based on a mistranslation of mechane into moikos, which is part of the baggage that Galileo sees himself as rejecting. Sternagel did some really good work on this, about how the two traditions, how the medieval usage came in and isn't the same as the Greek tradition. So I do think that they're separate.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Okay. Thank you. Let's thank our speakers. Just a reminder for those that are coming to dinner, it's at 7:30 at Gambrinus, so we've got some time. Thank you.